Hello and welcome to the Bulletin with UBS on Monocle Radio. Each week the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in finance take you beyond the numbers and hype, right to the heart of the big issues of the day. This week we're delving into a fascinating report from the CIO of UBS Global Wealth Management entitled Live Well Till 100. Be financially prepared to not only live long, but to also live well in Singapore. Cutting-edge medical tech, rapid advances in practical AI, and our own personal focus on healthier living mean reaching 100 years old could soon become the norm and not the exception. But can our financial health survive just as long? In today's edition, we're discussing smart portfolio planning to ensure investors can live well for longer. Here to reflect on these themes and to explain a little more about the UBS Wealth Way approach, which focuses on the 3 L's of liquidity, longevity and legacy, is Wen Ching, equity strategist in the UBS CIO based in Singapore. Wen Ching, a warm welcome. It's really great to chat with you. And this is an absolutely compelling topic. I read this education note about living well till 100. I guess here's hoping for everybody, right? But I guess the serious point to underscore this is that if you want to not just live longer, but live well, there's a critically important financial component to that. Was that the starting point when you and your colleagues were diving into this topic?
Well, what started as casual research about retirement and what happens if you live to 100 soon became a revelation for all of us. Because firstly, we realized that life expectancies have already been rising, and recent research from Sweden suggests that human life expectancy can increase to an average of 100 to 120 years of age within 5 decades or so. Now, to put that in context, that means that my grandchildren could live almost twice as long as my grandparents. Now, living longer obviously is positive news, but that also comes with the risk of financial capital depletion. So this is obviously a topic which we need to look into and plan for longevity.
Well, absolutely. And let's talk about planning, because we know on this programme from talking to colleagues from all across UBS how important it is to have an efficacious plan, to plan for whatever your preoccupation might be, whether that's the legacy you leave behind, the liquidity you need in the shorter term, and so forth. What does it take then, in broad brushstrokes, Wen Ching, in order to retire well and to enjoy those extra years? What kinds of ideas, themes, key points do people need to bear in mind, do you think?
Yeah, a few things that we discovered in the course of our research. Now, the traditional school of thought is that in our retirement, we just need to earn a portfolio return that meets inflation. And we all thought that that would be sufficient to tide us through our retirement. But actually, there are 2 gaps in this school of thought. The first gap is that inflation is a very personal experience. When we speak to our clients, most of them would tell us that the rate of inflation that they personally experience differs from the national headline CPI number, and it's often to the upside. Now, a few reasons for this. Firstly, that's because of the spending categories that wealthy retirees tend to spend in, right? They tend to spend, for example, in luxury, travel, fine dining, and these are spending categories which are inflating at a higher pace than the broad headline number. Now, the second reason is also because high net worth investors tend to not receive as much government grants as the average population. So for those reasons, the personal rate of inflation tends to differ, often to the upside. Now, the second gap in the school of thought is that while meeting inflation is the basic bare minimum that we should all strive towards, actually, when we take spending into account, we find that a portfolio needs to earn a return in excess of your cost of living in order for it to endure 50 years and beyond into your retirement. And the question here is, how much is that excess we need to earn? Well, after running our simulation models, we find that to spend comfortably 50 years into your retirement and beyond, one should aim for portfolio returns to at least exceed your cost of living by 2 percentage points.
Well, I guess the flip side of that, Wen Ching, would be then what if you miscalculate that? And presumably this is one of those areas where even a small shortfall, if we think of the compounding effect, it could have a very significant and deleterious effect in the longer term, correct?
That's right. So compounding has actually a very powerful long-term effect. If we undershoot our investment goals, a small shortfall, a seemingly small shortfall in the near term, compounds into a huge amount over many decades. For example, a 2% shortfall between one's investment returns and inflation erodes a portfolio's real value by 44% over a period of 30 years. So that shows us the power of compounding over the long run.
Well, let's zero in then on ensuring the longevity of one's investment portfolio. And I alluded earlier a little bit to this UBS Wealth Way approach, which we've discussed on this programme before: liquidity, longevity and legacy. If we factor in then these longer lifespans or try and reflect them in portfolio planning, what do some of the considerations look like, Wen Ching? What do people need to think about to make sure that they're delivering the buffer you've just described?
Sure. Well, the UBS Wealth Way approach focuses on different needs across time frames. So we have the first L is liquidity, the second L stands for longevity, and the third L stands for legacy. Clearly, if we are talking about living longer, we need to plan for the longevity pot to last longer so that we don't dip into the legacy pot. Now, as you can imagine, a higher rate of return in the longevity pot would result in this lasting longer, and it will also reduce the risk that we are forced to draw down from the legacy pot. So in other words, investors should seek ways to earn the highest long-term annualized return rate within their risk tolerance. So stretching out for greater returns is the most obvious solution to this issue. Now, alongside reaching for greater investment returns, there are other ways which we can extend the longevity of our investment portfolios. For one, we can lower our personal rate of spending. So for example, our simulation assumes that a retiree spends 3% or $300,000 of his investable assets, which we assume, say, for example, if he retires with $10 million of investable assets, right? So instead of spending $300,000 a year, for example, if you could bring that down to 2% or $200,000 a year, that would already help to extend the longevity of your portfolio by at least 8 years. So lowering our rate of spending is another way which we can extend the longevity of our portfolio. Now, the third way which we can extend the longevity of our portfolio is by lowering our personal cost of living. Everyone faces a different inflation rate, and this personal rate of inflation, which we call our cost of living, is influenced by many factors. For example, your lifestyle, your personal choices, choice of whether to go for fine dining or to dine at home, whether to study in an Ivy League school or a public school. These are all choices which affect our personal cost of living. So if we can bring down our personal cost of living, that will also help to extend the longevity of our investment portfolio.
Is it sometimes a tricky conversation to have? Because presumably there are some clients where if you need to have this slightly challenger mindset and say, look, to what degree you've espoused the values that you hold dear, but may I suggest that your habits actually differ a little bit from your values? Is that a tricky conversation to have, or is that part of doing the job that you and your colleagues do, is to make sure nothing's off limits and actually you have to discuss these things and really get stuck into the nitty-gritty in order to best aid your clients with their long-term planning? Presumably it's a delicate matter, if nothing else.
Exactly, which is why we need to be aware of our spending habits, especially in retirement. Often we don't think so much about our spending habits when we are earning an income, a monthly stable income. However, when we approach retirement and when that stream of income stops coming in, that's when we need to be more conscious about our spending habits. And if we want to be able to maintain and upkeep a lifestyle that we used to have while we were drawing an income, that means that we have to be able to invest for higher returns in order to fund that lifestyle.
And Wen Ching, I'm always interested a little bit in the geographies. Obviously, we're talking to you. You're sat in Singapore, and I know that some of the frames of reference in the report are through that geography as well. Is there a degree to which lots of the assumptions and ambitions that are framed in this piece actually do travel quite well, depending on the market? Obviously, we know that the life expectancy is very different from geography to geography, but are there some general learnings, or are there some quite interesting things which have a degree of specificity depending on where you're having this conversation?
Well, the broad takeaways are relevant across the globe. And what we find is that the relevant takeaways would be, for example, that firstly, we need to invest in order to extend the longevity of our retirement funds to fund our lifestyle. What is perhaps more idiosyncratic, it would be factors such as spending. Obviously, the rate of inflation differs across geographies. And obviously, living in a country with a lower rate of inflation would help to lower the personal cost of living. And life expectancy is also another consideration. What we find is that this researcher in Sweden thinks that life expectancy will extend to 100 to 120 years within 5 decades in most developed countries. So this is probably a learning point that is relatable across most developed countries as well.
And just to almost take a step back, Wen Ching, I guess it's worth just commenting briefly on some of the cause and effect here. We know about advances in medicine, medical technology. I guess we have to factor in the sort of third industrial revolution, the powerful influence that artificial intelligence is going to have, and broadly a focus on healthier living and well-being. Are these just some of the factors which are driving that underlying shift in profiles, which means that people will live longer? I guess people want to know why this is happening as well, and it's interesting to consider that.
Yes, definitely. Well, in Singapore, for example, life expectancy has already been on a gradual uptrend. And I think what's changed is that we have medical technology, we have AI, and we also have lessons learned from COVID. And coming together, these could help to propel the average human life expectancy even higher than what was originally modeled pre-COVID. So I think this could have been a starting point in the research which we found, where they are expecting human life expectancy to extend to beyond 100.
And Wen Ching, maybe just a final takeaway here. I'm sure this will resonate with so many listeners who find this absolutely, it's a fascinating topic anyway, and looking at it through the prism of being better prepared financially is compelling. What's the first thing people should do? Is it just to talk to their financial advisors, make sure that actually nothing's off limits and that you get into the nuts and bolts of planning, for an extended lifespan? What if people have moved to do something as a consequence of some of the topics we've touched upon? What's the first thing they need to do to get the ball rolling in this area?
I think the most important takeaway is to understand the power of compounding. Now, what might seem like a small investment rate of return today, if you compound that over 20, 30, 40 years, it's going to have a big effect on your portfolio. So start investing early to maximize the benefits of compounding. That's the first takeaway. The second takeaway is that, we should start to really think about our financial well-being if we were to live to 100. Can our finances tide us through 100? Especially if we are planning to retire at, say, 50 years old or 60 years old, right? That's going to mean that we're going to be retired for 40 to 50 years. So we need to think about how we want to fund that retirement and what kind of lifestyles we want to live in our retirement. So that would be a starting point to then say, okay, this is what my lifestyle is going to cost and how much do I need to fund this lifestyle that I aspire to have in my retirement. So those are the two key takeaways from our report.
And that's Wen Ching from Singapore, bringing us to the end of this edition of the Bulletin with UBS, setting the agenda in the fast-moving world of finance every week here on Monocle Radio. You can listen again and explore more at monocle.com. That's where you can join the club by subscribing to Monocle magazine. You can also follow this programme wherever you get your podcasts. And as ever, you can discover more and find out how UBS can help you by heading over to ubs.com. This is the Bulletin with UBS on Monocle Radio. I'm Tom Edwards. Thanks for listening.